Well, good evening, everyone. My name is David Van Zandt. I'm the president here at the New School, and I want to welcome you all to this celebration of the life and work of Eric Hobsbawm. A special welcome to all the students, alumni, faculty, colleagues, friends, and admirers of his work. I think your presence here is a real testament to his legacy. I'd especially like to thank our distinguished speakers for being here, as well as thanking Anya Schriffen and Ira Katznelson for the help. They really did help put this all together, and thank you very much. Finally, a very special welcome to the family, to the members of the Hobsbawm family, wife Marlena, Julia, his daughter, and Andy, his son. Welcome. Very quickly, Eric Hobsbawm was born on June 9th, 1917 in Alexandria, Egypt. He died on October 1st, 2012 at the age of 95 in London. He was a historian, teacher, and author of over 20 books, including the Age of series, The Age of Empire and The Age of Extremes. At the New School for Social Research from 1984 until 1996, Eric Hobsbawm was professor of politics and society, and then later a visiting professor. Finally, he had a jazz connection. Early in his career, he moonlighted, writing under the pseudonym Francis Newton as a jazz critic for the New Statesman. He also authored The Jazz Scene in 1958 and Uncommon People, Resistance, Rebellion, and Jazz in 1998. I never had the pleasure of meeting Eric personally, but I did get to hear from a large auditorium one of his lectures in London at the LSE in the mid-1970s. And I was a big fan of his early study, Primitive Rebels, rural revolutionaries in the 19th and 20th centuries. And I'm very proud that the New School was his intellectual home for such a distinguished person, a distinguished historian, astute scholar, and prolific author. He was an exemplary thinker who embodied core values of the New School, finding innovative approaches to old questions, challenging the status quo, crossing disciplines, taking a global approach, and with the idea of creating positive social change always in focus. His years at the New School were active, fruitful, and inspired. He made important contributions to the Committee on Historical Studies, the New School for Social Research itself, and the university as a whole. In a speech he gave at his retirement party in December of 1995, he said, "I have had a wonderful time at this school. I've been able to try out the ideas for 3 books I've written during these years on New School students, and I've learned a lot while I was doing so. This is because the school has by far the most interesting lot of students I've had the good luck to teach, and certainly the most cosmopolitan one. There is no other place quite like it. Where else is there a learned institution which spreads its wings impartially over jazz, fashion, design, and philosophy? Where else is there a learned institution situated between the Village Vanguard and Bradley's, and within hailing distance of both Balducci's and the Union Square Farmers Market?" We are very proud that Eric Hobsbawm was part of our history. The values he stood for are very much part of both our present and our future. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Julia Hobsbawm, one of Eric's children, his 3 children in total. Andy and I are here with our mother Marlene. Eric had 9 grandchildren, some of whom you've seen on the pictures. So we're here to represent the family and to thank, with great gratitude, the New School, in particular Jessica Hajmanek, who's worked incredibly hard for a small box of chocolates for her trouble. My father loved 3 things that all are combined and distilled by what this afternoon represents. He loved his family and his friends. He loved travel and in particular a cosmopolitan culture. And he loved academia and his students. And for some reason, New York had just the best of all of those elements for him. He would have agreed with, in fact, he did agree with the statement that the late, great Englishman in New York, Quentin Crisp, once said to me, that the reason why he liked this city is that there's nothing you can wear between Houston Street and 14th Street that is remarkable or would get you stared at. And he loved that. The only thing that's missing from a beautiful autumn day like this in New York is, of course, him. I would have loved to have gone to a deli with him where we would drink that peculiar New York drink, Dr. Brown's celery soda that he loved. Or we would get in a taxi together and he would lean forward and in a rather excruciating accent say to the driver every time, "Where you from?" And then he would exchange very detailed economic data or football talk with them. We talked a lot about his passion for New York and his friendships with one of the two people I want to thank before I hand over to Andy, and that's Anya Schifrin. Anya was somebody who he loved very much as a child, as the daughter of his great friends and publisher Andrei Schifrin and Lena Schifrin, and he admired her enormously as her career progressed. And she and her husband Joe Stieglitz hosted a lovely small supper for us a couple of nights ago, where they encouraged my rather reticent mum to talk about her memories of him. And he would have liked that very much. And also present that night was the other person I'd like to thank, and that's Ira Katznelson. Ira was a colleague of his here at the new school, and it is quite clear that they just had a blast. Whenever Dad would talk about Ira, he would smile. And when he died, it was a condition that Ira would be asked to fly over and say Kaddish at the funeral in London. And that was quite peculiar because he was a totally unobservant Jew, my father. And I have to say, both my husband and the historian Simon Sharma were really quite disappointed when Ira's plane touched down on time. They were there, yarmulke ready, to say the prayer. But it was Ira that he chose. And I think Ira, along with Anya, has made a huge contribution to today. And my dad didn't have a brother, but I think if he had a younger brother, it might well have been Ira. So on that note, I'll pass you to my brother, Andy.
I also wanted to echo my sister's thanks and give a particular shout out to all the speakers on behalf of the family. Our dad was asked so many times to speak at the funeral of friends in later years that we used to call it his day job. So we actually really understand and appreciate the time that this takes, and given all the heavy academic commitments people have. And of course, he would have been absolutely delighted that so many friends and colleagues were here to say a few words and remember him today. It's well known that Dad had a sort of deep connection with certain geographies and cultures and the politics of those places. Latin America and Brazil, for instance, France, Italy, and of course the US, apart from perhaps certain elements of the politics. But of all of these places, New York is the place that I think is particularly special to me because I got a chance to share his experience of it with him. My sister and I would come over when he taught at the new school, and we'd come for visits. But later I worked in New York from 94 to 98 and met my wife here. So we crossed over for a couple of years, and I have just brilliant memories of our times together in this town and going to the aforementioned Bradley's and the Vanguard and museums and shows and dinner and a movie, usually a gratuitously violent thriller that our other halves would never stomach. And New York sort of symbolized, I think, the things that Dad loved most about life and the world. It was a fusion of sort of cultures and ideas and politics and a kind of passion and exuberance for living mixed with this hard-boiled, no bullshit talking and politics and art and intellectual debate and a hunger for self-improvement through education that he thrived on. And for that reason, I think, for me and for us, will always be a piece of him in New York, and it's a place that captured his spirit, I think, genuinely like no other. So wanted to say thank you all very much for coming and here to celebrate him today and his time in this city. Thanks very much.
I met Eric Hobsbawm in the 60s or in the early 70s of past centuries. Discussions between us on history and politics led me to feel a growing esteem and appreciation for the extraordinary richness of his knowledge and culture, and particularly for the originality of his approach to social history, the history of rebels and of revolutionary movements, history of the working class, and in more clearly ideological and political terms, history of Marxism and of socialist and communist parties. In this spirit of mutual esteem and sincere friendship, we produced in 1975 an interview, I could better say a dialogue on the Italian Communist Party, which was published and successfully welcomed in many European and non-European countries. Well, today, so many years and decades after, I want to remember Eric Hobsbawm and pay a tribute to him as a man and as a scholar of great courage, consistency, and sense of mission. His qualities were at last universally recognized after the publishing of his last work, The Age of Extremes. In a few words, Eric Hobsbawm remains an example to be followed.
I'm Jonathan Fanton, the President Emeritus of the New School. I first encountered Eric Hobsbawm as an undergraduate at Yale when I read The Age of Revolution. It captured my imagination as no other work had and played a critical role in my decision to become an historian. But I first met Eric here in New York at my inauguration as president of the New School in 1982, just down the block, the Presbyterian Church. I wanted the occasion to celebrate the rich mosaic of the New School, and therefore I asked each dean to recommend a person for an honorary degree, someone who represented the values, traditions, and aspirations of one of our divisions. The graduate faculty selected Eric Hobsbawm. As I conferred the degree on him November 16, 1982, over 30 years ago, and I can visualize where we were standing as I speak, I read the following citation. And just imagine Eric standing here. Historian, teacher, England's chronicler of our collective dreams and achievements. You inspire scholars everywhere with your uncompromising attention to truth and fidelity to the human condition. Your monumental work reflects a mastery of the social sciences. You elucidate the shape of modern capitalism and the meaning of class and culture. Your knowledge spans Western Europe's centers and peripheries, as well as the dynamisms of peasantries throughout the world. You combine deep understanding of the aspirations and limitations of social movements with acute perception of the reasons and consequences of protest. We celebrate these extraordinary contributions by conferring upon you the degree of Doctor of Humane Letters, honoris causa, 31 years ago. Well, some months later, Dean Ira Katznelson proposed that we appoint Eric as a university professor. The graduate faculty at that time was having its troubles, having lost authority to grant PhDs in political science, sociology, and philosophy, and in fact, its very future was in question. Under Ira's leadership, we'd begun to recruit a cohort of new faculty, including Ari and Vera Zollberg, Charles and Louise Tilley, appointments which signal our commitment to rebuild. But when Eric agreed to come, it sent another signal, a powerful reaffirmation of the graduate faculty's ties to Europe and a tradition of placing the social sciences in historical perspective. Eric played a major role in the founding of the Committee on Historical Studies, which gave shape to the intellectual character of the next chapter of the University in Exile. And he became a full member of our community, interested in the whole university. And when we were considering the creation of a jazz and contemporary music program, and it was not an easy decision, I turned to Eric for advice, as I did on other challenges the university faced. In all matters, he always gave me his best judgment and honest opinion, directly and sometimes tartly. I listened to his private and public critiques with great regard because I knew they were always motivated by love of this university. I appreciated his desire to make it better. I admired his intellectual integrity, and I trusted his sense of fairness. And so I'm honored to have had the opportunity to make common cause with Eric Hobsbawm as he searched for a more just, humane, and peaceful world.
Dear friends, well, what can one add to the many words that have been written and spoken about Eric Hobsbawm's erudition, loyalties, and commitments, his rich stock of experience, his sparkling eyes and knowing smile, his remarkable combination of warmth and analytical intelligence, his aesthetic sensibilities and radical distrust of fads, his commitment to history with a capital H and an insistence on distinguishing fact from fiction, his capacity for rich friendship and his abounding heterogeneous array of friends, his affair of love with Marlene for more than a half-century, his keen pride in his children, his joyous life as a grandfather in late age, or the full range of a complex personality and an equally complex politics. His, after all, was a life as large as what he called the most extraordinary and terrible century in human history, a life signified by that Golders Green funeral at which Kaddish was said, and the gathered exited to the strains of the Internationale. Unique. Here, I want to speak of Eric, not in his words, as the somewhat unusual case of a lifelong but anomalous communist, and not of Eric as the consummate analytical historian who wrote like an angel, or of Eric as the active participant in British public affairs, or of Eric as a global figure, or of Eric as embedded in London society and the Welsh countryside, or of Eric as an honorary fellow of King's College, Cambridge, president of Birkbeck College, and the recipient of the Balzan Prize for European History, or of Eric's appointment by the Queen to the Order of the Companions of Honor, alongside such other distinguished members as David Hockney, Judi Dench, Doris Lessing, and the honorary member Amartya Sen, who is this evening's keynote speaker. Rather, I should like to speak of Eric here in New York at the New School. As Jonathan Fanton has just told us, he arrived as part of an effort that sought to give new form to the University in Exile's heritage, including its tradition of rescue for scholars who, like young Eric in Vienna and Berlin, had been exposed to interwar depredation. To tell the truth, I was staggered at the alacrity of his positive reply when, as a still new dean, I telephoned Eric at his London home at Nassington Road to inquire whether he might consider an annual semester at the New School. Surprisingly and uncommonly, Eric did not ask about salary, fringe benefits, or other terms. He explained that having bumped up against the then mandatory age of retirement at Birkbeck, he would relish the chance to continue with teaching, especially at an institution sharing many of Birkbeck's features. He thus said yes, enthusiastically, even before he knew the conditions on which he was being engaged. Writing in Interesting Times, his wonderful autobiography, Eric described both schools as, quote, being somewhat anomalous parts of academia, adding, and I quote, how the peculiarity of the new school's graduate faculty was its combination of heterodoxy and internationalism, and its ability to attract unusual students. There was, he wrote, almost no more varied and stimulating a body of students anywhere. I once counted 20 nationalities in my class. Since they knew more about their countries and special fields than I learned at least as much from them as they did from me. Eric's teaching at the new school was truly remarkable. He utilized his classes, as we've heard, as integral features of his research and writing. The preface to his extraordinary book, The Age of Extremes, explains how that volume, a book, and I quote, by an open-eyed traveler, or what my ancestors would have called a kibitzer, was crafted, he wrote, in large measure, and I quote, in lecture courses on 20th century history to graduate students of the new school for social research. Eric, of course, had burst on the new school scene already a legend, but he never carried himself as such. What struck me most about Professor Hobsbawm, his student, the historian Barbara Sirikos has recalled, was a certain modesty about his status as teacher. A certain modesty, but also a certain assertiveness, a certain set of skills, a certain zest for ideas, a certain capacity for closeness and camaraderie, a certain ability to seize life, a certain combination of flexibility and intractability, perhaps above all a certain zest for justice. It was in this very room, on this very stage, in October 1985, that Eric Hobsbawm joined Perry Anderson, Christopher Hill, and Edward Thompson to consider the agenda for radical history, celebrating such history for having won, and I quote, a place for ordinary people, common men and women, and for having saved them from the oblivion of the present. Eric concluded with a battle cry. To understand our present, we need the past, and those historians who are not afraid to look both in the face. Even before our friendship fully blossomed, Deborah and I invited Eric to a family meal at our home on the Upper West Side. Our young twin daughters, Emma and Leah, had been jumping on Emma's bed, which collapsed just as the doorbell rang. Without ceremony, Eric asked for tools and effected a repair. Marlene does not believe this story. Fast forward 6 years, Emma arrived home one evening from high school at Horace Mann to tell us excitedly about what she called, and I'm quoting, a remarkable coincidence about that carpenter who comes to our house. In history class today, she continued, we were assigned a fascinating book by someone with the same name. A carpenter Eric may not have been, but he was an original person, a grand friend, a terrific colleague, and a truly great craftsman.
Many of my fellow participants this afternoon, maybe most of them, were already accomplished and accredited scholars when they got to know Eric Hobsbawm. I was not. I was a junior in college, one of a group of undergraduates, including my sister, by the way, who took a class that he gave while he was a visiting scholar at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. Some in that group of Harvard and Radcliffe students, nobody from MIT signed up, by the way. Some in that group of Harvard and Radcliffe students may have been convinced that they were the ones who had discovered the world and that they already knew everything about it. But most of us recognized that we were wet behind the ears, not yet even apprentices, let alone journeymen, in the field in which Eric Hobsbawm was by then a master craftsman. I, for one, did not even know at that time that I would eventually enter an apprenticeship in that field. Here is the wonder. Eric Hobsbawm treated us as though we were colleagues from whom he had quite as much to learn as we from him. Needless to say, it was not true. Neither, however, was it a pose on his part. Rather, I would say it was a moral outcropping of the intellectual curiosity repeatedly identified in obituaries and appreciation since his death as one of his chief assets as a historian. No detail was too small or arcane, and no person too obscure to be incorporated into the dazzlingly unpredictable body of knowledge upon which he drew at will. Some years after that class, after I had finished college, had spent a year in Africa, and entered graduate school, my sister and I encountered Hobsbawm at a conference at Ruggles. And supposing that after all those years he would not remember us, we approached with the intention of reintroducing ourselves. Instead, to be met with a big hug and a warm greeting and acknowledgement by name. Hobsbawm's all-absorbing curiosity was not antiquarianism, though he could summon from his store items that would set an antiquarian salivating. As a random example, take this gem from his posthumous book, Fractured Times. Bela Lugosi played the Indian hero of The Last of the Mohicans in a German film version produced before 1914. I spoke of his curiosity as a moral outcropping because for Hobsbawm, the writing of history always had an ulterior motive, and that motive was human emancipation and human dignity. That motive is central in a favorite of mine among Hobsbawm's essays, Barbarism, A User's Guide, originally an amnesty lecture. Equally, it was central in a lecture he delivered some years ago in which he paid tribute to historians who, sometimes at risk of their safety and even their lives, spoke out against the misuse of historical evidence to justify xenophobia and genocide. But that motive is equally to be found, if not featured front and center, nevertheless present in his 4-volume history of the long 19th and short 20th century. Whether the events he analyzed ended well or ill, and in truth he could not know that finally, and neither can we, the ulterior motive of human emancipation and dignity always underlay the enterprise. I had not realized that Fractured Times, the book I mentioned, Fractured Times, Culture and Society in the 20th Century, was in the works at the time Hobsbawm died. So when I came on the book on a shelf in our neighborhood bookstore last spring, it was like suddenly meeting a friend I had not expected to see again. Of course, he left us a large body of work to which, like many of you, I return over and over again. Just last week, my graduate colloquium read selections from The Age of Capital. But a new book in that familiar voice, even in the familiar Baskerville typeface, felt like an unexpected opportunity to have a last talk with Eric Hobsbawm about what some Caribbean people refer to as things on time. It was also an opportunity to delight once again in Hobsbawm's virtuoso technique on sparkling display in the essays that make up the volume. And I can't give you more than just a taste before I end. Some of them are somber in tone, ruminations on the future of the arts in late capitalist society, for example. But the one I'd like to call to your attention in closing is entitled The American Cowboy, an International Myth, ? It sounds like fun, and it is, but it is also classic Hobsbawm. It begins with a typical maneuver, dispelling the reader's as yet unearned familiarity by stating the question in unaccustomed general terms. Why is it that populations of mounted men herding livestock generally but not always become the subject of powerful and typically of heroic myth, and why among the many myths of this kind did the one generated by a socially and economically marginal group of rootless proletarian drifters who rose and fell in the course of a couple of decades of the 19th century USA have such an extraordinary, indeed unique, global fortune. And what follows has all the characteristics: the internationalization, other people had a West, other people had a myth. The American myth had international forms that were not derivative from American popular culture. And the element that's always present, there was also the political and moral motivation at the end, the rumination about how that cowboy myth it reaches fruition, for example, an American Secretary of State whom I'd rather not name, and ruminations on what kind of society produces the fantasies of an individual anarchist that are often underlying the cowboy myth. So it was meeting an old friend and meeting familiar themes, but also in a new form that seeing the posthumously published book did for me. So it was a chance to say hello again as I was saying goodbye.
It is now a bit over a year since Eric Hobsbawm, the magnificent historian and one of the greatest of human beings, left us. It's hard to describe the huge gap that his departure leaves in the lives of his many friends who miss him constantly, and of his numerous readers who remain eager to read his next book. What I want to talk about is not so much the gap that Eric leaves in our lives today, but the way he filled up the breaches in the lives of so many of us over many years. I think I come from a somewhat different background from most of the speakers here today. I first encountered Eric's writings and ideas at the age of 17 in the College Street Coffee House in Calcutta, across the street from Presidency College, where I was an undergraduate studying economics and mathematics. The dominant intellectual tradition of Calcutta at that time, and indeed for many years after that, was a rather odd kind of intellectual Marxism with a mixture of dedicated scholasticism with planned but not executed actions to improve the world. Not quite what can be called praxis, but threatening all the time to break into praxis. Along with friends in the college, I think here particularly of Sukuman Chakravarti and Sipra Sarkar, I remember exchanging views on the relevance of Marxist perspectives in history and of Eric Hobsbawm's particular contributions. We had a good discussion at the end of my first year at Presidency in 1952 on the founding of Past and Present, very much under Hobsbawm's leadership. Shortly after that, I had to undergo a tough regime of radiation therapy for an early case of oral cancer, and the primitive treatment then available in the only dedicated cancer hospital in the city required me to hold a radium mold in a lead case in my mouth in 6-hour sessions each day for 7 days. Since I was absolutely not allowed to move around, reading books and articles was the only pleasurable thing that I was allowed to do. The writings of a young Hobsbawm made frequent appearances in my treatment room. And they did get me engaged, even excited, about things happening in the world, in the past and in the present. It helped to strengthen my resolve, then aged 18, to go on living in the exciting and analyzable, as Eric showed, world. When J.B.S. Haldane, who had moved to Calcutta, and became an Indian citizen, was dying 12 years later in the same city, Calcutta, of broadly the same disease, cancer, in the same hospital. He wrote a memorable poem called Cancer's a Funny Thing. It was a wonderful poem, which was published in the New Statesman. And when reading it, I remember thinking of the mixed with, of course, with my great sadness at Holden's fatal illness. I was very privileged to know him also. That the mixture of high-dose radiation and high-powered Hobsbawm, which entered into different parts of my head at the same time, was indeed a funny gift of my cancer. More practically, Hobsbawm's worldview, which was already beginning to emerge, helped me to think about reasons for living and my determination to fight my disease, to experience more of that spectacular world. No one could better describe and assess that world than Eric Hobsbawm. I was luckier than Holden, and about a year after being released from the cancer hospital, I went to Cambridge as a student to complete my undergraduate education. Given the intellectual background from which I came, it was of course natural for me to seek out the company of Maurice Dobb and Piero Sraffa, which was easy enough since they were both in my college Trinity. And of course, Eric Hobsbawm, who was then a fellow of King's College. My first meeting was arranged through a fellow undergraduate, Prahlad Basu, who was at King's, who kindly asked Hobsbawm, another hero of mine, Morgan Foster, also at King's, to tea in his rooms. This was in October and November of 1953. I remember those couple of hours of intellectual excitement at a time when I was particularly seeking insightful ideas for my immature mind, quite a bit influenced by Marxist thinking, without being sufficiently convinced to be an actual Marxist, then or later. I was especially bothered by what seemed to me to be the decadence of a once creative tradition that seemed to be then engaged in producing very formulaic Marxist analysis of literature, a lot of it as crude as formulas can be, and Marxist economic analysis, which sometimes could match the lit crit in naivety. Just as Maurice Dobb and Piero Sraffa stood out as being instinctively impatient in a determined way with formulaic rote learning, so did Eric Hobsbawm in the field of history and in all fields touched by historical analysis, and that has to be a long list of fields. I know there have been debates on what many friendly commentators have regretted as Hobsbawm's unwillingness to opt out of Marxism and his communist sympathies. I can see where these laments come from. And yet, these laments may miss out. What these laments may miss out is the way Hobsbawm was generating extraordinary departures, worked out within and in fact helped by the intellectual discipline of Marxist thinking. It was not so much that Hobsbawm was a great historian who carried Marxism as a decoration, or to take a more severe stricture, as the fifth wheel of his otherwise wonderful coach, but whose extraordinary use of Marxist thinking runs right through all his writings and gives it a distinctiveness without shutting out creativity that he could not have easily harvested in other ways. To give just an example, an analysis which took my own thinking, in one of his lesser-known essays called Where Are British Historians Going?, published in Marxist Quarterly in 1955. It came out just when I was graduating from Cambridge. Eric Hobsbawm discussed how the Marxist pointer to the two-way relationship between ideas and material conditions have very different implications in the contemporary world than in the world that Marx himself knew. In contrast with the intellectual dominance of focusing on the influence of ideas on material conditions, which was powerfully present in mid-19th century, with many major thinkers, Hegel among them, focusing broadly on that, which made Marx himself, an early Marxist, concentrate on the other side, the more materialist side. In contrast with that, in the mid-20th century, the historical schools, I believe Eric cited here Louis Bernstein Nemier, had taken to a kind of materialism, particularly of a very narrow kind, dominated by seeing human action as being almost entirely motivated by a simple kind of self-interest, against which he thought it was the duty of Marxists to protest. Eric argued that the demands of our time, in line with the general principle of a two-way relationship between ideas and the material world, require us to focus particularly on the importance of ideas, which was exactly the opposite of what Marx was advocating in his more empirical political writings in his own time. But that is precisely in line with what Marx was arguing for as a general principle of examining the mutually supportive relationship between ideas and material conditions. In illustrating this distinction, Hobsbawm went on to defend Edmund Burke's critique of Warren Hastings, with Burke's invocation of great and grand ideas, including that of justice, Hobsbawm disputing the Nemerian skepticism that the ideas were far less important for Burke than his own material interest in the East India Company in his incentive to debunk Hastings. Hobsbawm's powerful defense of the grand role of big ideas was important for history, but also important for understanding, I believe a philosophical understanding, of the contingent nature of the actual implications of general principles in reading the world. I can give many other examples, coming all the way from the age of revolution, age of capital, to how to change the world and fractured times, where Eric worked as an informed heretic while remaining loyal to the underlying intellectual framework, thereby vastly expanding the reach of Marxist analysis. Eric's remarkable originality made that combination possible, in a way that would be missed if we try to see him only as an excellent general historian who happened to carry with him the label of Marxist thinking. I've been very fortunate to know Eric in many different capacities, as a friend, as a teacher, as a general advisor, and someone whose company, along with that of Marlene and their wonderful children, I sought and luckily got. As a fellow apostle, these days people do not seem to be so cagey about talking about such allegedly secret societies. I also saw, partly with the help of Eric, something which made me go against my earlier thinking, how elitism had a very nice, productive, and even enjoyable face, so long as that is not the only thing that keeps one engaged. Just before Eric got together with Marlene, Eric and I and my previous wife, Navnita, took a 6-week car trip together through much of Europe, but particularly involving Austria, where Eric had been as a young man, and Italy and France. Marlene was then, this is 1952, a secret. But I soon became aware that Eric had a list of things to buy on the way, particularly in Italy, given by someone who had a general resemblance in my imagination to the Dark Lady of the Sonnets. Actually, the Dark Lady's list included, I remember, some stoneware and some food components. Since later on, Eric and Marlene would become very much a part of my settled existence in London, I have to appreciate how Eric's dual role in my life, personal and intellectual, so easily merged together. I remember keeping my eyes on the fog ahead of us as we drove across the Jura Mountains, with Eric telling me not to get so engrossed in listening to him, even as he was clearing up my foggy understanding of the exact mechanism through which early Christianity spread in Italy. I wish education would always come with such delight. Thank you.
Well, hello. I am honored to be here today to add a little bit of a jazz voice and context to this wonderful event for an incredible person. Certainly, Eric had a very significant role and an impact as a jazz historian, especially filtered through his lens of social consciousness and his commitment to the common man. I actually had the opportunity to actually have, I think, one conversation with him as a very young administrator back in the day. I was fascinated to hear Jonathan talk about him as saying something about the jazz program. It must have been positive enough. We were born, and here we still are. But having evolved a little bit, I would love to be able to go back and have a deeper and much more meaningful conversation with him. You've heard reference that among his jazz work, it was well known for more than 10 years he wrote a jazz column at the New Statesman under the pseudonym of Francis Newton. And it's the deeper significance of that name, who was a real person, some of you may not know, that I find quite remarkable, and I just want to unpack that a little bit in the context. Frankie Newton was an African-American jazz trumpeter, communist, deeply sensitive man and artist, and of course naturally directly affected by class and race in his time. He was in New York beginning in the 30s. He had the house band at Cafe Society. Now, Cafe Society has its own incredible story in the history of jazz and our area here. It's just over in Sheridan Square, just literally blocks away. And it was started by a Russian Jewish immigrant named Barney Josephson. And it was the first racially integrated nightclub in New York City. So Frankie had the house band there. Frankie also was on the original recording of Billie Holiday singing Strange Fruit. That record came out in 1939. And the lyrics actually were written in the mid-30s by a New York City public school teacher, Abel Maripol, who was at that time a member of the American Communist Party and who later became much better known as the adoptive father of the two sons of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. But Strange Fruit, I hope there's some awareness of that. This is a powerful, haunting song about lynching in America. It's been called the original protest song. It had a significant impact on the politically aware among artists, musicians, actors, and other performers, and broader layers of students and intellectuals. Cafe Society had a good run for about a decade or more. However, in 1947, Mr. Josephson's brother Leon, a communist, refused to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and as a result, Barney was pummeled in the press, customers left, and as a result, both the Uptown and the original downtown Cafe Society clubs were forced to close. But I relay all this story because what might seem unknown to many, what might seem whimsical to others, I think speaks so much, this use of Francis Newton as his almost alter ego, speaks so much to me in evidencing a statement of his identity and purpose, his ability to connect the strands of musical, cultural, social, and political history and how that related into his social conscience. In this love of jazz and knowledge of jazz, I find that very fascinating, and I wanted to just share that with you as my own little sort of lens of observation about he the man. I'm very pleased now to introduce a trio of our talented jazz students, and I believe Eric wrote about many aspects of jazz, but of his time and place, I think he's more of a traditionalist, so I think he probably would be very pleased at the choices actually our students have made. They're going to come back a little later in the program, but they're going to come up now. So this is Martina De Silva on voice, Albert Balawas on saxophone, and Jonathan Thomas piano. And they're going to perform the U.B. Blake classic, Memories of You.
Waking skies at sunrise, every sunset too seems to be bringing me memories of you. Here and there, everywhere, scenes that we once knew, and they all just recall memories of you. How I wish I could forget those happy yesteryears that have left a rosary of tears. Your face beams in my dreams, spite of all I do. Everything seems to bring memories of you.
Hi, everybody. Officially, I'm supposed to introduce and moderate the panel, but of course, I'm going to take a little time to talk about Eric and the Hobsbawms. And Marlene, I apologize. You told us to stick to time, but I'm going to break a little time if that's okay with you. My father's Andre Schifrin and the book publisher, and our family's been friends with the Hobsbawms for so many years that I don't even remember how it started. And in fact, it was reading the program this week that I discovered it was the Apostles, which is such a secret society that it was a secret even from us that that was how Eric and my dad met. Marlene and my mom are friends, and I'm really close to Andy and Julia, and so is my sister. And my whole family's in Europe now, so when Eric died, Akbar Noman said to me, organize something in New York, which I know Vicky de Grazia had wanted to do. And I called up my dad and said, Daddy, what should I do? And he said, well, call Eric Katznelson in the New School, of course. So I did, and Jessica Hedgmanic and David Von Zandt and the New School have been fantastic. And I was so moved because this whole year, when I picked up the phone and we called Amartya and we reached the unreachable Barbara Fields and we sent emails to Robin Blackburn and Eric and Victoria, everybody said, of course. And everyone got on a plane or got on a train and came, and so did all of you, and so did the Hobsbawms. So thank you for that, and thank you for all the help. I have, of course, so many memories of Eric, the sort of gimlet-eyed, eagle-eyed, quick intelligence, that huge brain that absorbed so much information and took in everything from all around the world and distilled it. And those romantic stories I remember hearing about, the illegal printing press that he ran in occupied Berlin, and his time in the army where he got to know all these workers and sappers and peeled potatoes. And he always struck us as the most sort of amazing, glamorous person. And there's a few things about Eric that probably many of you know, but some of you don't, such as, what was the first thing that Eric always did when he went to a new city and checked into a hotel? Picked up the phone book and started reading it. Sometimes he'd look to see if there were other Hobsbawms. Sometimes he'd look to see what was going on. But it was that lively, lively intelligence that he had that always made him interested in everything. Another thing that as a child really impressed me was the fact that you could never lose an argument with Eric. And I'm sure some of you have been on the receiving end of this, because just when you thought you were winning, Eric would all of a sudden come out with a fact that nobody else in the room knew. So you just think, I've got him this time. And Eric would go, well, what about Bratislavia in 1848 or 1947? And no one else knew, so they lost the argument and Eric won. Before I introduce the panel, I'm going to tell my last story, which actually I've never told anybody in the world. So here we go. I think it was about 1982, and I was living in England, and of course that meant staying a lot with the Hobsbawm family. And the US did something terrible. I can't even remember now. I think it was bombing Libya. And I was, of course, like a good Schiffer and a good Upper West Sider, I was totally outraged. And as an American living in England, I felt I had to do something about it. So I thought, I know. I'm going to go to the U.S. Embassy and throw ketchup on it. And there was going to be some big official rally against the United States, but for some reason I couldn't make it. So I thought, I'm going to go. And I didn't know if the embassy guards would have guns, like in America, or if they'd shoot me. So before I had my bottle of ketchup, and before I went up, maybe it was tomato juice, I went up to the embassy guard and I said, I just want to warn you so you don't shoot me. I am about to throw tomato stuff all over the embassy at Grosvenor Square. And they said, all right, love, go ahead. So I tossed my stuff, and they immediately got me in this sort of thumb lock. They had me down on my hands and knees kind of instantly. It was painful, but it wasn't painful because it was just my thumb. They took me to jail, they arrested me, and then they were very good-natured and they let me out. And I was about 20, and I thought, well, I need to call a parent. Well, who do I call? Obviously, the Hobsbawms. So I had their number memorized, which I still do, and I phoned, and Eric answered, and I told him what had happened, and he was so in the spirit of this story. Immediately, he was like, do you need a place to crash, man? Do you need a pad? Can we come pick you up? You could just feel that energy and excitement. So I just wanted to, again, first time I've ever told that story to anybody, and thought you might enjoy it. But that was the Eric, and I know that our illustrious panelists, you've all got the program. So Robin Blackburn, Eric Foner, and Victoria de Grazia. I'm not sure if maybe 15 minutes, but thank you very much, and thank you for letting me take some time to tell my stories too.
Well, I want to talk about a particular achievement of Eric as a historian, because we've heard and we know what a wonderful historian he was, and there are many ways of doing it, and he could be an enormously enjoyable historian, an enormously politically relevant one. But I want to draw on something which I think is particularly special, and that is that he was a global historian for a global age, and that the fact that his books, especially Age of Extremes, was translated into 37 other languages, and the other age books all were widely translated, I think that's hugely important, because it means other cultures, he had something to say which they needed and wished to read about and to hear. And I think although national history is indispensable, every country needs its own history and will insist on having it, but the transnational, that I think is where Eric really scored and showed a new type of history could be written. And in fact, others have followed in a trail that I think he blazed for the first time, a particular type of global history that was as popular as it was, because it's also about everyday people and everyday resistance. He's interested in popular culture, but he doesn't counterpose that to high politics, which certainly has its own centrality. So I want to just give a few examples. I suppose underlying this approach of Eric, there's the red thread of political responsibility. So I think I very much want to second Barbara's earlier enthusiasm for the cowboy essay. And just to bring out one important dimension of it, I mean, it shows immense learning. Obviously, from his autobiography, we know that his uncle, who was also in the role of his father for a while, was involved in the film business, and that gives these amazing detail to his account of the Western film. But he also talks about the cowboys having been quite a disparate lot, a few even women, but certainly Hispanics, certainly blacks, and other strange migrants from different. And he says something that was a bit sinister was the whitening of the cowboys, so that the cowboy became almost wholly WASP by a certain point in the 1940s. And I think it's that sort of point that is very important. I also want to mention when I first knew Eric, we got involved in in work that was explaining what was going on in Latin America, and in particular the Cuban Revolution. And in Cuba, I had the privilege of being with Eric on some fascinating car journeys, and his ability to speak to any Cuban, including peasants in the Sierra Maestra, and discussing the great issues of the day with them, and his sort of absorbing. But we also met Che Guevara, and I have had a very, it's been fascinating to me to see that he wasn't sort of bowled over by meeting this legendary figure, and grilled him quite toughly, and actually disagreed quite strongly with the Foucault theory, as he explains in his books. But later on, he did say to me, you know, he's a very impressive guy. I see he actually appears on the cover of How to Change the World. And there is something about Che. I mean, he got his military strategy actually turned out to be disastrous and politically not thought through. But there was something about his personal conduct, and that's something that Eric writes about in Revolutionaries too. His internationalism, that very much was something that was dear to Eric's heart. And then also the fact he'd spurned privilege and power, and laid down his life, that was something that gave him a moral stature. That means, I mean, he discusses how there was some sort of rather absurd aping of Che in sort of sectors of the New Left. But he also said that his stature in Latin America was something which was a great asset to the left in Latin America. And I think the fact that left-wing politics have thrived, and even in Bolivia, the country where Che was killed and fought his last campaign, and where he was completely isolated at the time of his birth, just as Eric was warning. Yet at the same time, just not so long ago, a couple of years back, Evo Morales campaigned for president with that poster, the one that appears on the cover of How to Change the World. So I think that we can see here that Eric did have, an underlying political message, and that was always central to his work as a historian and his work as a political analyst.
It's an honor to be here. I'm delighted to. Oh, I'm sorry. It's an honor to be here and be able to speak for a couple of minutes about Eric Hobsbawm. Like Barbara Fields, when I met him, I was not a student, but I was a very young assistant professor and doing research in London, and I just sort of turned up on his doorstep, and he immediately invited me to come and attend this seminar on social history he was running at the Institute for Historical Research. And that year was really an education far beyond anything I'd gotten in school over here, even though it had some very, very excellent teachers. And then later, when he and Marlene were here at the new school, they used to come every year to our house for Thanksgiving, and I well remember the kind of very interesting political dialogue between Eric and my father, who was a couple of years older, and another product of that earlier period of the 20th century and of Marxism, et cetera, et cetera. But I just wanted to talk for a minute about why should American historians read Hobsbawm? Maybe that's an absurd question, although American historians tend to be a fairly parochial lot, so we sometimes ask that ourselves. Of course, his work had an enormous influence in the 1970s and 80s on the rise of social history, labor history here in the United States. Really, that renaissance at that point of studying the history of ordinary people and their agency, as the phrase goes, would have been inconceivable without exposure to his works like Laboring Men and Primitive Rebels and wonderful books like those. Today, as Robin just said, of course, Hobsbawm offers an example of global history, international history, whatever you want to call it, which has become something of a mantra or almost a cliche nowadays in many ways. Everybody is trying to globalize their history, which of course is a good thing to do, but Hobsbawm did it without falling into many of the traps that I think exist in some quarters today, simply piling up coincidences. German unification took place around the same time as the American Civil War. Fine, but what is the underlying historical point or causation operative there? But Hobsbawm always does this within an overarching interpretive framework, which Amartya Sen pointed out, of course. There's an old saying that with Marxism and 2 facts, you can write about anything. Hobsbawm marshals a lot more than 2 facts. He draws on an amazing array of information from around the world. But at the core is this, what we heard, this sophisticated Marxist underpinning that sees class conflict as the driving force in historical change, but completely rejects determinism, inevitability, any kind of notion of teleology. The basic insight underlying this is that capitalism, which is really the subject of all his books, basically, capitalism, is a total global system, which has to be analyzed in its entirety, which is why he ranges over the globe, and also why he delves not only, as we've heard, into economics and politics, but the arts, science, other realms. The longest section on the U.S. in the Age of Empire is about the early cinema, as we've heard his interest in the cinema and its influence around the world. So in The Age of Capital, Hobsbawm speaks of the emergence of, quote, a single world history in the middle of the 19th century, which is a really interesting concept. I don't think we've explored its implications sufficiently. But for us American historians, I think his work offers a challenge to the bane of our historical writing and our political life, which is American exceptionalism, without losing sight of how these global processes are always worked out in specific national settings. So I do think and hope that American historians, and know, will continue to read Hobsbawm to learn how to do global history at the highest level.
I think one of the countries where Eric Hobsbawm's thought has been so adopted and picked up in the way that Robin Blackburn describes is Italy. So I'm hoping that, Victoria, you'll talk to us a little bit about that. Thank you.
Yes, I have been asked to speak about Eric's connection to Italy, his Italian connection. And indeed, it was I think in 1976 that I first met Hobsbawm. That was how I called him, to keep a very respectful distance. And it was in the Upper West Side home of John Cammett, who had written the first English language biography of Gramsci. And we were there, the three of us, to compare notes on the English translation of the interview that Napolitano referred to, which he had conducted and published in Italian with Giorgio Napolitano, called The Italian Road to Socialism. And at the time, Napolitano was a spokesman for the Italian Communist Party's moderate wing. And in 1975, when La Terza publishers wanted to publicize the Euro-Communist program in Italy to middle-class Italian electorate, they asked Napolitano to do an interview book, and he asked that Eric be his interviewer. Lawrence and Hill then was doing the English translation to introduce to the American public Euro-communism. At that time, the Communist Party of Italy's historic compromise was to bring into a coalition government the communists with the Christian Democrats, from which the communists had been excluded since 1948. And so we felt a great urgency about American foreign policy, which was vacillating at that time about whether to continue to obstruct the communists from coming to power. I'm afraid the book had no effect. It continued to be obstructed. But meeting Hobsbawm, in any case, made an indelible impression. It was cocktail time, and John, a one-time steel worker, brought out his whiskey and wine, only to have Eric, with some very small, indefinite gesture, eliminate the very notion until we had worked about 3 solid hours. John laughed uproariously at the joke. The Italian Third Way passes through the Fourth International and comes out on Fifth Avenue. Eric smiled a little stiffly, maybe because he had already heard it in Italy. I was simply transported by his rigor, commitment, and analytic vigor. Now, before that meeting, his works, however, had become very central to my vocation as an historian, trained in the United States, but also in Italy. And not just me, but at that time, of course, other students, but especially women students. Some of us chose Thompson, some Hobsbawm. I was the latter. And it was the Hobsbawm of primitive rebels. And I was shocked, I remember, when somebody said he was arguing about that primitive meant backward, archaic, ignorant of the party line, blind and groping. Those are his words. Because I saw compassion, not condescension, in his vigorous writing and robust characters. To use his words, that these people had not yet found or only begun to find a specific language in which to express their aspirations about the world. And in that sense, what he was doing is he was picking up on the work of Delio Cantimori, who wrote a very important book right after World War II called Italian Heretics in the 16th century. This was one of the very first people he had contact with in Italy, introduced to him by Piero Zraffa. And Contimorti's heretics were really proto-anti-fascist, and I guess I regarded myself, but I think this was true also of Tema Kaplan and Deborah Valenza, who couldn't be here, as sort of subaltern and rebellious, proto-leftist, proto-feminist, and therefore we were very, very attracted to Hobsbawm's work and to Eric himself. Now, Hobsbawm's connection with Italy went way beyond his connection to Eurocommunism and to the Communist Party. The Italy he knew from the 60s connected Western and Eastern Europe. Paris, Milan connected to Belgrade and to Prague. The third Italy was the Italy of the new industry of the 70s. And Italy was a font of themes for him, but also political insights about Great Britain. I think that was a prism that helped him see so precociously Labour's impasse in the wake of Thatcher's election, which in 1978 already led him to deliver the annual Marx Memorial Lecture, the text of which then became his famous essay for the Forward March of Labour Halted, with a question mark, which tasked the British Labour Party and the British Communist Party to begin to take very different stock of its constituency to include new middle classes, but also working women. If his attachment to Italy, and I think the Italian left, made him more forgiving of Eurocommunism and not to see its real limits, it also did keep him, over the years, closely in touch with a society whose sensibility and language he shared, where he and his family have very dear friends, but also offered him a way of reflecting on the catastrophe of Europe in the 20th century. My eye very recently was drawn to his essay on history, On History, which is titled Identity History is Not Enough. It's in 1994 he wrote it. His point of departure was a history conference held in a small Italian town in Tuscany to commemorate the 40th anniversary of a German massacre which killed 120 of the 300 villagers, and which had historians from all over Europe and the United States mixing it up with the locals, the villagers who had experienced it firsthand. And what Eric did there is he admitted his deep uneasiness at having to confront the subjectivity of the villagers with the universal science of the historian, something which he believed in very, very much. And indeed, after reflecting very tactfully, in a very compassionate way, he did move to take issue with the relativism of identity politics, including feminist historiography and postmodernism. I guess what I found so remarkable there was that rigor, again, that commitment and candor that enabled one to agree with him, but then also not to agree with him. And reading his memoirs brought me back to that stance. In them, I felt as close to him as I had felt in my primitive rebel stage. And he was as exacting about his history, about his own history, as about the subjects of his historical writing. It showed that he had the courage to write about what he understood about himself and the world, but also that great frankness and lack of vanity to confess what he did not understand.
You've led very nicely into something I wanted to ask those of you who've known Eric Hobsbawm for years, which is really his intellectual evolution. And I didn't know if Robin Blackburn could maybe talk a little bit about his sort of evolution into really a public intellect, the figure of being a public intellectual a bit more. You've talked obviously about some of the international influence he's had, and I didn't know if anybody also wanted to touch on the question of his evolution really as a historian. But anyway, please, Robin.
Yes, the first thing, I mean, there certainly are changes and there's certainly an important evolution, but really the remarkable thing over such a long period is the tenacity and the constancy, really in some of his earliest writings, as in some of his latest writings, you find this apprehension that free market economics is going to produce disaster. He's saying that in Age of Extremes, 15 years before it happens. Deregulation, huge inequality. This is a recipe for bubbles and a big crisis. And actually, I I suspect that the articles that Amartya was reading that he described to us so vividly by Eric, because these were his first writings. His first articles were on the crisis of the 17th century, in past and present, in, I think, 1953, and which aroused huge debate at the time, to which the American Historical Review returned in 2004. Rather extraordinary. They don't normally have a round table on a book published, or some articles actually published 50 years ago. They did then. And what was the thesis of these articles? It was that the crisis of the 17th century was brought on because there was luxury consumption of the aristocrats and of the monarchs and the courts, but there was not mass demand. That was his crucial point. There was too much poverty, and this narrowed the market. And so you already have that idea, although it's expressed, there are just a few little hints that you're going to get the Hobsbawm of later on, because he's very interested in consumption. And he said the consumption of these aristocrats, he says, it doesn't matter how many wigs they ordered from their perruquier, or how many grand meals from their chefs, or how many grand edifices from the stucco artists. He said that is not going to create mass demand. That's not going to create economic recovery. And I think in Manhattan in the year 2013, this is, the luxury consumption one can see going on not too far from here. This is the sort of thing Eric said an unbalanced economic society is going to produce and precipitate all sorts of untoward political developments and economic catastrophes. So I think it's that constancy I would stress.
I don't know if Eric...
Well, I mean, just to add for a second, I agree with Robin that fundamentally the basic kind of questions that are of interest to him stay pretty much the same throughout his entire long career of writing history. The sort of subject matter through which he addresses those questions expands and expands and expands. Like, I think of his book on nationalism, which is something he hadn't devoted as much attention to. I think of, he moves away, you're right, he starts out really as an economic historian. And he wrote that great book, Industry and Empire, which we don't mention, which is part of an economic history of Britain. But then he moves into these other realms. But the basic question is the same. But I think his political evolution, we don't have time to go into that in great length, is very interesting. I mean, I think back to the essay, The Forward March of Labor Halted, ? Don't forget there's a question mark at the end of that title. But he's laying out the possibility that as some kind of trajectory toward greater and greater social democracy is actually being thwarted. And it really, from the 70s, lays the groundwork, or puts out the question of, the kind of forces that basically are leading to the world we're living in today, 30 years later. But he kind of sees that so he's a realist. He's not a romantic. He's maybe this progress that we've seen at that point is really coming to an end, and what then are the political implications of that? So, I think his political views change over time in many ways, but his underlying historical problematique, if I can use that word, stays the same.
Victoria, did you want to have the last word on the panel? That's not the whole last word.
Yes, what I found so striking was in some ways the seamlessness in his work, though, between the political engagement and this writing, and that he was able to carry it out with such an extraordinary contact with societies. I think of Italy, but not only Italy, this is true in Latin America, which saw him as their own. And this is just a remarkable capacity that he was, in some sense, not just a public intellectual, but a global intellectual.
Absolutely, that's right. Robin, I see you clutching the mic. Did that mean you wanted to say something? No? Okay, great. In that case,
one point on that. He once told me, is this true, Molly? He once told me he made more royalties on books in Brazil than any other country. So that's just a sign of this international presence he created.
Great. Well, thank you all very much for traveling long and far, some of you, and thanks to the panel.
From what I've heard, Eric Hobsbawm loved Ella Fitzgerald, And this is a song she was famous for singing. It's called Stars Fell on Alabama. Moonlight in magnolia, starlight in your hair. Oh, the world a dream come true. Did it really happen? Was I really there? Was I really there? We lived our little drama. We kissed in a field of white, and stars fell on Alabama last night. Forget the glamour. Your eyes held a tender light, and stars fell on Alabama last night. I never planned in my imagination a situation so heavenly, a fairyland where no one else could enter, and in the center just you and me, dear. My heart beats like a hammer. My arms wound around you tight, and stars fell on Alabama last night. Stars Thank you.
Not fair to have to follow that. Just spectacular. I'm honored to have been asked to say some closing words for this memorial. For Eric, I can't add very much to the performance, to the brilliant insights, warm recollections. We've heard a lot today, and I'll be brief. This is a New School event, and it's not by coincidence. So as Dean of the New School for Social Research, first of all, I want to thank Ira Katznelson, my predecessor, for bringing Eric Hobsbawm to us. Eric's legacy will always be part of ours. He was our own. What I want to speak about is the legacy of Eric Hobsbawm at the New School for Social Research, both about his presence, how his presence in the halls at the time affected us, and how today it challenges us as we move this very unusual institution, the New School for Social Research, then in his day called the Graduate Faculty of Political and Social Science, how we move it ahead into this very strange 21st century. I was lucky as a young professor to sit on a few dissertation committees with Eric, so I had a chance to watch his great mind at work, to observe up close his supervisory style. Perhaps not surprisingly, he liked supervising economics students. My recollection is of someone who showed enormous joy in helping young scholars, mentoring in the best sense of the word. And I think we've heard this in the accounts of his general intellectual sensibility, not by dictating answers and methods, but by taking students' work very seriously, posing very detailed questions, listening carefully to the answers. Students felt respected and challenged at the same time, just the right combination needed to nurture serious, engaged scholarship from advanced graduate students preparing to enter the professional world of ideas. I realized that Eric would probably very strongly resist the notion of ideal type theorization. His work represents a strong testament against the use of ideal types as the basis for generating knowledge in social sciences. So Eric would likely not be pleased to know that his career at the New School generated a problem of the ideal type. Today, a Hobsbawm type appointment is the name for the gold standard for a long-term, usually part-time appointment where a world-class scholar teaches every other semester or so at the New School and plays a major role in the intellectual life of the university through teaching, faculty seminars, and supervising students. We are constantly, even in 2013, searching for candidates for a Hobsbawm type appointment. A key to the Hobsbawm type appointment as a model for success for the university is that the scholar fit the ethos of the New School for Social Research. The New School faculty is full of smart, interesting, even radical critics of capitalism, for sure. But this is not the only or most important way that Eric's scholarship connected to our ethos. And while he wrote, like many of our New School faculty do, about the political and class implications of the international movement of people, money, and things, this also was not what put him so seamlessly into intellectual debates at the New School. The key, from my perspective, was the way he engaged with history, as social, as grounded, and as operating at the same time at the lowest levels of working class health, well-being, and rebellion, and at the highest levels of civil war, revolution, imperial geopolitics. This integration of the micro and the macro forces, always with a focus on human freedom, and as Barbara Fields noted, human dignity. This insistence on a deep connection of fine-grained, sometimes first-hand knowledge with the overriding macro dynamics of society. This is how we at the New School connect to Hobsbawm, the historian. And what about the New School of the future? What lessons did we learn from having Eric Hobsbawm as a colleague that might help us as we move forward? When Hobsbawm wrote about the legacy of colonialism and imperialism and the failings of capitalism in the 20th century, his warnings and predictions came to sound unrealistic by the end of the century. Capitalism had triumphed with the collapse of the Soviet Union and velvet revolutions in Eastern Europe. This combined with the apparently overwhelming forces of international interdependence. People and cultures, goods and capital moved across international borders at unprecedented rates. More recently, and against the odds, democracy was in clear ascendance, with democratic transformations in Latin America, of course, and then now across the Arab world. All this was greased by the wheels of technological change, and in particular, the digital revolution, which radically changed the way we communicate and even the way we see and read. These triumphs filled the imagination of many with great, sometimes utopian hopes. Capitalism's triumph over socialism would solve problems of efficiency, individual freedom and motivation. Globalization would lead to an equality of opportunities to work and unprecedented consumption possibilities. Democracy would satisfy the innate desire for individual freedom. And the digital revolution would greatly expand access to information. Today, just a few years after the triumph of capitalism, globalization, democracy, and information technology, these social changes leave us far from the utopian hopes, and with a strong residue of economic stagnation, income inequality, political mayhem, refugeeism, terrorism, and counterterrorism. Capitalism's triumph has pushed us into a series of economic crises. Globalization has brought many out of poverty, but has also left us with enormous pockets of destitution and despair. Democratic revolts have left deep unresolved conflicts and a new list of failed states. Information technology has brought access and also a perilous specter of government and corporate surveillance. This residue left in the 20th century by the triumph of capitalism, globalization, democratization, and digital culture often goes unreported and is certainly under-theorized. We find ourselves again in a moment where the ethos of questioning, critique, radical alternative narratives is essential. And this is the challenge that Eric leaves us with at the New School: how to resist the utopian narratives, continue to build alternative theory and narratives that connect the micro and the macro dynamics of social change, and that appreciate that the residue is often the main event. I want to thank you all for holding the conference here at the New School. The Hobsbawm family, Marlene, Julia, Andy, Anya Schifrin, Jessica, the organizers of the conference, an amazing lineup of speakers, performers that we've heard from today, and I know an audience filled with friends and admirers. I can't tell you how many people have reached out to me in the last few weeks as the conference approached, how Hobsbawm's books transformed them at important formative times in their lives, opened their eyes to a new way of thinking about history. The New School benefited then, and we continue to benefit today from having had Eric in a Hobsbawm type appointment. Thank you.